Well, welcome everybody to our June Cloud Communications Industry Briefing. I'm Tim McLean, the Director of Marketing here at Commio, and super excited to have Michael Tindall, one of our co-founders and our Chief Architect. Michael, welcome in.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, appreciate it. I know we don't get a chance to get you on many of these, so I was very excited when we talked about this and worked on this, and I think it's a really needed update to a topic that we certainly talked a lot about, which is hard to believe, Mike, but we're coming up on the second anniversary. June 30th, 2021 was when the FCC mandated that stir shaken was adopted out there. It's hard to believe that 2 years have gone by.
Yeah, 2 years since implementation, but we've been talking
Right.
about this for 3 years.
Yes.
I brought that up at the last conference. I can't believe how fast time has flown. But yeah, here we are.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But before we get into that, just some real quick housekeeping items for everybody on the call. Obviously we're recording it. We will share the recording afterwards. We know people are busy. If you have to jump off, that's fine. You won't miss anything. We'll make sure you get the recording. Just mention that, we'd love to get your questions. Use the chat and the Q&A boxes, and we'll thread those through the discussion. And as always, when you get those emails from us, if there are things you'd like us to cover, feel free to respond. We're very receptive to that. And education is a big part of what we do here at Commio. Keep everybody up to date on everything from compliance on the text messaging side to what brings us to today is a really important and needed update on Stir Shaken because, and Mike, we'll get into it in a minute, but it's a lot of misnomers. There's a lot of things that people think they may know about Stir Shaken that may not be entirely correct. And it's important to set everybody's expectations and knowledge set a little bit of a reset as we go through, the next few months. But I wanted to say too that just a quick reminder, Mike, it's important to remember why Stir Shaken exists in the first place, and that's that 2017, 2018, the FCC was saying that, robocalls, illegal robocalls were the number one source of consumer complaints. More than 46 billion robocalls in 2020 alone. That's the last year we have data for. So, just a reminder, it's interesting, Mike, to spit this out, but, Stir Shaken, stands for Secure Telephony Identity Revisited. It's a mouthful there, but it says a lot. And then shaken is signature-based handling of asserted information using tokens.
Tokens.
They had to work hard to get to that, right? But it works.
Kind of like Shield.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I actually forget what that stands for. My Marvel trivia is not on point today. But I think what was that, Mike? Do you know what it is?
Something like Strategic Homeland.
Oh
I
yeah,
forget the enforcement and logistics division. I mean, they made it up.
there you go. Pretty close. Yeah.
Intervention. Yeah.
Right. And I think and the other thing as part of this too, Mike, is interesting is, I've revisited taking a look at the list of folks that had to register as part of this with a robocall mitigation database. And the last time I looked, that's closing in on 7,000 individual companies, entities that registered as part of that database. So, really, I think, to level set, the entire existence of Stir Shaken was to start a process of trying to mitigate these illegal robocalls that are kind of the scourge out there. And, it's gotten us to where we are today. We can revisit how that works. But you just got back, Mike, from the OpenSIPS Summit out in Houston. And, there's a wide variety of technical folks that go to that event. But I think when we were planning for this session, you mentioned that you were kind of shocked that people weren't talking about new sort of OpenSIPS capabilities, but they really wanted to talk about compliance, right?
Yeah, I was shocked. Was set to go to an OpenSIPS summit and ended up the first 2 days being at a regulatory summit, which I think is good that at least the folks that are sort of at the edge of software development in the space are talking about this at length. So I thought it was a good, refreshing first half of the day. Towards the end of the day, I was tired of talking about Stir Shaken, but after I caught my breath and got back, I thought, we ought to get together with Tim and the rest of the marketing folks and really put out an update based on what we've learned, because we had the opportunity to meet and speak with a lot of folks who are authorities in this space. Got to meet with some of the folks from TransNexus who write some of the legal positions and advocate to the FCC for, sort of the course and direction of things. Met with some folks at Cinch that are on the regulatory side and had a nice panel with them. And I thought it was very informing, enlightening, and just productive discussion. Sitting around the lunch table at the intermissions, we had a lot of just sort of water cooler stand up sort of talk. And there's still a lot of, there's still a lot of confusion in terms of, when to do things, when to not do things. Am I doing it 100% right, or am I doing it mostly right? There's a lot of that going on. So I think you're starting to see everything sort of shake out as we're all now living in this environment and now sharing these sorts of interactions, meetings, ideas, uh, and clarifying discussions, I think, are starting to happen. So if nothing else, I wanted to share sort of some of the high level things of what we talked about, so that we could continue that sort of knowledge share across the industry.
Right. And you gave a presentation there, right, Mike? And that's what we're going to base today's
I
discussion on,
did.
right? Hmm.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
called Beyond Stir Shaken. So this slide deck, this backdrop here, is mostly what was presented. We added a few little things since then, but this was a discussion and a presentation aimed at a large pool of OpenSIPS developers, and folks in this space. And I want to say we had definitely over 100. I'm not good at spot guessing a room, but it was a full conference room, so I'm guessing about 150 folks that were there, that were actual developers and or regulatory or software people of some kind.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All right.
So yeah,
Mhm.
so the sort of kickoff here was, okay, great, we have Stir Shaken. What would you say you do here, right? What does that mean? We're all signing, right? Uh, A, B, or C.
Mhm.
Uh, does it end there? Does that fix everything? Does that achieve, sort of the goal of the intent of what the industry is trying to do? I would say absolutely not. I mean, Stir Shaken is a tool. It is one of 5 or 6 things that are presently being used to sort of determine the legitimacy of a call. Really, Stir Shaken, and if we go to the next slide, is a system of accountability. Borrowed this graphic. I thought it illustrated clearly the old way of how complaints were investigated. The victim or recipient of the call would get a call they didn't like. That most of the time they probably wouldn't even say anything. But those that did say something, maybe some of those turned into a report that made it to an investigative team that would initiate a traceback or some sort of legal inquiry. They'd send you a request, typically from FBI, DOJ, some sort of law enforcement entity. Sometimes it could be the carrier, but at least in our experience, it was more official than that. And you were required to provide all the telemetry data from to date, time. They'd give you, here's the numbers we're interested in. We need to know everything you know. And we'd do that and say, okay, here's the IP addresses of where they came. And then they'd repeat the process, go to service provider C, B, who knows how long that goes on. So that's really, I think, what Stir Shaken was designed to sort of streamline, in that now you can point directly to the signer of the call as the ingress point. Um, Regardless of what the attestation level is, you can at least have that piece of accountability that says, I signed the call, and based on what I know about the caller, here's the attestation. So it's sort of, in my opinion, and the opinions of a lot of people, this is what it was designed for. It was designed for tracking ingress points into, at this point, IP telephony networks. Now, the accuracy of how you're signing calls, ultimately, nobody can prevent anyone from putting A, B, or C whenever they feel like it. But as calls are getting authenticated on the recipient networks, they're tracking things like, the accuracy of the attestation level. Well, I've got an A coming in from this service provider, but I also have it coming in from this one, or it's B when it should be C. They're tracking that stuff. So ultimately, what they're doing is developing a reputation around the certificate itself. So one of the things we talked about at the conference was, hey, yeah, you can do what you want, but ultimately it's your reputation at the end of the day. What kind of reputation do you want to have? Um, I could certainly see scenarios down the line that certificates with reputations below a certain threshold are just considered garbage, right? Block the whole certificate. Um, so that's sort of where we are, relative to the implementation on stir shaking. Next one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at the time, this was like Monday. No, it was Tuesday after this order came out. This is just a snippet from, I believe, the seventh order. Where the FCC is expanding, well, not only compressing the traceback timeline to 24 hours, 24 business hours of response when you get tracebacks for everybody. The other part is adopting the new rules that apply to all voice providers, not just those of us that are registered either with an OCN or in the robocall mitigation database. All voice service providers are required to take reasonable steps to mitigate this stuff. And it's interesting that they use the word reasonable. I talk about this, from a legal perspective. This is an open hole, right? This is the wiggle room. I don't think we know what reasonable is yet. But I would say that we all have good ideas of what reasonable should be. And I think that it's prudent to go ahead and start making those moves for some sort of plan, whatever your particular plan happens to be. If it's a blocking algorithm, if it's a, more advanced sort of learning algorithm that analyzes traffic and develops either t-shirt sizes or color coded sort of risk levels of calls that you at least at a minimum are flagging and I can identify for like future remediation, or that you just go ahead and start doing remediation now on certain types of calls. But we'll talk about some of the things that we look for. I'm not going to talk about everything we look for, because we can't give away all the secrets, but we'll share some just to sort of maybe help some people get started on their journey. We can talk about that. I laughed at this because I guess we're not part of public, because there's a public comment on a variety of robocall tools. Nobody's asked me anything, and I asked for a show of hands in the room at that time. How many people have been contacted? I think the only two people that raised their hands were like TransNexus and Cinch, and a couple other large sort of entities that are active in the legal side of this. But by and large, there's a group that I call sort of a trusted advisory group that they go to, because they clearly can't talk to everybody, but they have a trusted advisory group that they rely on and are seeking data and information as to what type of blocking strategies, algorithms, analytics, sort of tools, who owns the master do not originate list, or is this like a capitalist sort of environment where we're going to have a bunch of people, or is it three, kind of like what we have with the analytics companies? That's all to be determined. I think right here, what you're seeing is just telegraphing. And when I read these things, I don't read it as, oh, okay, I'll just wait until they tell me what to do. I look at this as, you need to go ahead and start thinking about what we're saying, because the likelihood that a vast majority of what we're saying now will be an order or some sort of reality in the future is very, very high. So I think we take these as cues to go ahead and start getting our acts together now, versus, when the order hits. And we talk about how and these are just some examples. I mean, there's a million different ways to do things. These are some of the things that we've leveraged, just from a data analytics and storage perspective. How do we look for things we care about? Depends on the type of data, depends on if I'm looking at highly structured data or non-structured data, depends on if I'm looking at macro level uh, telemetry, versus the raw records and the raw detail of what's in those records. And then how do you ship things around your network or your environment so that everything that needs to know about these things can know about it? And, that's where something like a Rabbit MQ comes in terms of creating events and shipping them not only around a local data center, but in between data centers or even different cloud environments, so that you can, easily get things like blocks or DNO information or whatever out and around your environment. And once you have things to measure and you have a place or repository that you're measuring them from, how do you do it? You can do post processing, which we'll talk about. We do a lot of things in post processing because not everything needs to happen right this second. It's okay if I have eventual consistency within a few minutes or a minute of some sort of algorithm that needs to take a look at maybe a couple 100,000 or 1,000,000 calls, right? But starting with OpenSIPS 3.2 with the enhanced statistics module, they've got a lot of cool things baked right into it. Is it perfect? No, but it is a really good block in your sort of building block toolkit that you can use that's got a lot of stuff baked into it, so you don't have to spend tons and tons of time on development trying to figure out how to calculate average length of call, network efficiency ratios, ASR, CLI. One of the things we like to look at is source and destination country relative to the account and whether or not that's a typical pattern for them or not. We look for historical normal patterns versus what's happening now. And that's part of our reasonable strategy and attempt to be, I don't want to say the word compliant because there's no order yet, but when it does come, and it will come, this is how we're teeing our network up to be ready for that. And this is an example of like an old way that we used to track things. Like I said, I'm not going to share all of this, trade secrets, but here's one of the ones we started off initially. It's just a simple SQL analytics query that looks at a data warehouse. We use, for this instance, of MariaDB column store. Used to be InfiniteDB back in the day. That company went defunct. It went open source. Maria picked it up. MariaDB column store is the current iteration of it. It's really awesome for ingesting millions and millions of records and performing aggregate level queries, not go find exact records, but here's 2 billion records. Tell me the ALOC on all, things that have these characteristics. Like if I've got I've got 4,000 calls from an Annie in, I don't know, what does this one say? We're current day. So today, and it's less than $1 of retail revenue, flag that for somebody to look at, or even just go ahead and create an automatic block for that Annie. Like it's clearly not doing, something's wrong. This is an example. You can do these things across however you want to calculate, different metrics and statistics. And then, you've stored it, you've analyzed it. What do you do about it, right? We're fortunate enough to live in an environment where we've got a lot of really cool, free, some have enterprise versions, but a lot of the free stuff does really cool things. Things like Memcache, Redis, and Couchbase, they're all loosely kind of related. But what do we do when we find something we're interested in? How do we tell everything on the network that needs to know about it, like all the ingress points in the network that are doing things like authentication and traffic enforcement, before you get to more CPU or network intensive operations, like looking up an LCR profile and calculating what the route set needs to look like? Why would I do that for something that's going to get blocked anyway? Right. So sequencing is also as equally as important, if not more important, than the how of how we're doing all this. And what we're talking about here is all the how stuff. We stored it, we analyzed it. Now, how are we going to enforce it, right? We ship things around using Memcache, Redis, and Couchbase, depending on the type of data. Like if it's just a simple key value versus like a JSON object. Um, Couchbase is really, really useful for that with their XDCR function. It's really set it and forget it. You point it at another cluster and tell it what you want to replicate, and it does it. And then you just stick JSON documents in there with whatever you want. That's one of the great things about unstructured data, is that you can modify and adapt it without having to come up with this really well thought out sort of schema. So it's perfect for these types of applications. But yeah, we push things across networks in both Rabbit, Couchbase, ultimately lands in some sort of local instance of Memcache, so we're not banging on the network all day. But we stick it in there with a time to live, which is basically just a self-destruct timer that says after this time, if you don't see any new updates on this document or key, just destroy it. So it keeps us from having to spend a lot of time on administrative data cleanup. If something's hot and we keep setting it, it'll just stay there. If we don't touch it, it goes away, which is nice. So after we authenticate whether or not you're even allowed to send us traffic, the first thing we do is start rolling through these cached items, and some, not necessarily all of it's not necessarily related to blocking a call. Sometimes we need more information to make other decisions, things like grabbing the LRN of where it's going to, so I can look at, which network it's going to and whether or not there's any special rules for that particular network. Then we hit our DNO lists, which is a do not originate list, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then we have an internal list of blacklists, we call them. That this is 3 examples. This isn't everything, but is the ANI blocked? Is the country and the account blocked? Is the from to blocked? You can keep going with this. You get really creative and really complex with this, which is why it's important to have some sort of automation. And we'll talk about AI about this much. I don't think we're quite there yet for this very basic sort of, data analytics proposition, but in the future it could get there. If nothing less, it's something fun and cool to talk about. But, and then you can use things that are, if you're using OpenSIPS or Commio, or really those are the 2 big ones that we work with. The rate limiting module does a lot of great things to help you create valves or choke points that you can not necessarily have to block something, but you could really, really crank it down and then raise a rabbit alert or some sort of other alert for somebody to go look at, investigate why it got ratcheted back. Maybe you're on Slack and you want to send something into a Slack channel that tells somebody to go do something. There's endless possibilities with that. Next one. Yeah. So I talked about DNO. There's 2 major lists right now. Somos and ITG. Somos, at least in my circles and the folks that I work with and talk to, seems to be the leader right now. I kind of think this is going to end up being like I don't know, Ford versus Chevy thing, or like a format war, HD DVD versus Blu-ray. I think Somos having the toll-free component really sort of gives them a leg up. And right now that's really what it's focused on, is the toll-free do not originate, meaning like I'm Microsoft help support, right? I never am going to call out from the main Microsoft toll-free support number. So therefore, I'm putting it on this do not originate list, meaning this phone number should never make a phone call ever. If I'm going to call somebody, it's going to come from some other number, not 1-800, whatever their number is, right? That's what DNO is. These numbers should never be used to send an outbound call. That's one use case. Another use case is, well, I'm a carrier and I've just procured 1 million numbers for my inventory to be served to customers at a later date, but I have to have inventory because I can't procure them on demand. So I have to buy a bunch of them, pay for them. They're sitting there as assets in my inventory. They've got a cost associated to them, but no revenue because I haven't sold them. The last thing I want is to say, great, I've got a customer. They want to buy my toll-free number. I sell them the toll-free number. And the first time, they go to use it, it's flagged as spam, or it's been guessed by a previous scam campaign, or auto generated by, somebody who took the time to figure out what valid number blocks are and just started iterating through, adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they just happen to hit that number. It's designed for, at a minimum, those two use cases, and I think extensively beyond that. But they're also going to be, and I'm told later this year, I don't know when, but later this year, extend that for 10 DLC numbers as well, where you, if you're a customer of this particular product, can put blocks of your numbers in there as the rifle owner to keep them from making phone calls until you sell them or assign them. And instead we talk about this much about AI, I had to throw it in here because every time I turn around, people want to talk about that, and I think it's just because it's gotten so much press. But is this time? Do we need more sophisticated detection tools? Maybe. This stuff is kind of easy right now. We're not looking at like incomprehensible data dimensions. I can still look at a CDR record with my human brain and understand it. Right now, as things get more sophisticated, or maybe we get tired of writing scripts and you just want something to do it for you, fine. I think at some point it'll be there. I think that it's more of a science experiment, or sort of, hey, this would be a fun, cool project to work on. And I think, I agree with that if you've got the time. But there's an old saying that says, never pass up an opportunity to pee. And I said, or hand marketing something fun they can go send out 50,000 emails about, or put in a press release. Sorry to pick on you, Tim, but
I felt that. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you have to, as product owners, developers, always, at least if you're in a position in the organization where you have influence over product, you should always be thinking about the sales and marketing aspects of it too. And I look at it as sort of a hand in glove kind of relationship. Yes, we have to build these products, we have to build these tools, these features, but as innovative sort of product owners, I don't think our responsibility should stop there. I think that you have to take your thinking beyond just how does it work, and yes, I push the button and the light turns green, to why is this useful? How is this going to be heard, received, resonate in the marketplace? And what sort of steak and sizzle am I giving to my company, my marketing team, to articulate that to the every person, right? Not everybody's going to understand all the technical components, right? You've got to have something in there that's relatable. And right now, this is very relatable. I'm not saying it's a good relatable, because everything they're talking about with AI is all Terminator, they're going to take over the world and kill us all kind of thing, but there is a place for it. So, and right now, most of the engines that we have access to are, chat driven, sort of things that you can feed data to, and it'll go give you an answer back. I've not been that at all impressed with some of the answers I've gotten back. I have to keep refining my questions to eventually get the right answer, but I think it's just a function of time.
Right.
So, one of the most, sorry, we're going to take a drink of water here real quick.
Yeah.
One of the most, I guess, common misconceptions, and I was guilty of this as well, was when Stir Shaken first came out. I remember that first webinar we got, I think the entire question pool at the end was like, how do I get an A? How do I get an A?
Yep.
I don't ever want spam on my,
right.
And there's two people that ask that question, really. I mean, there's legitimate users of that, and then there's the folks trying to figure out how to get around it. And it's always interesting. I don't know if it's just me doing this so long, I can always pick them out based on the type of question. But the biggest, I guess, misconception is that Stir Shaken controls the output of what happens on the other end of caller ID, whether or not it's spam likely or blocked or whatever. It's not. It has virtually no bearing. It's one of 5 or 6 different metrics that we've identified, we've talked with our friends at Numerical. I've got a number of colleagues over there. We've talked to others, but the attestation level, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, is really uh, the the accountability portion of it. It's like it came in on my network. I know it's the end user that is directly using that number, and I can prove it. Or B, it's a service provider I sold the number to. So, I sold them the number, but I can't guarantee that they're the rightful owner user of the number. And then C is always the same, which is I don't know anything. It's an international number, or I don't know this number at all. That's really the first piece of it. And it's a component that works all the way down the line, but the reputation is really controlled by the big three. And, I've heard them referred to as the cartel. I've heard them referred to as the mafia, by different people, by the way,
Yes.
that don't communicate. So I thought it was kind of interesting, but there's three. You got, TNS, Hyatt, and First Orion, and they're partnered with their respective mobile providers in this country, the big three. And they run their own reputation analytics algorithms, as well as their own reporting, consumer reporting applications. Like I've got T-Mobile, I have an app on there as a consumer. I can report. It goes right in to First Orion's algorithm to figure out if it's good or bad. I think that we put a lot of power. We flipped everything and basically completely empowered the consumer, who may or may not know exactly what they're. I mean, all they know is they got a call they didn't want to get. It's easier to click spam than it is to block it or to do something else. So what happens is, I'm not saying that they should never click spam. Certainly there's a ton of spam calls and I click it myself, but there are scenarios where things get improperly flagged. I used to do it all the time, because I don't know if you remember when the iPhone first launched their button, my muscle memory was so ingrained to hit like block, but they had flipped block and report and put that on top. And I reported a bunch of stuff accidentally. And then it was like the next software update, they flipped it. So you had to like move your thumb to hit the block and report. And I was like, oh, thank God. And as a person in the industry, I felt really bad. I was like, oh my God, I just reported somebody's number. I didn't mean, there was no like unsend button. It was done. Right. So that got stuck in somebody's database somewhere. But I mean, this has a higher bearing on what you're going to get, in terms of spam likely is, their internal algorithms, which we can debate how aggressive they are. I think they're sort of commercially prohibitive at some points. But it's not just the reporting aspect of a consumer clicking it that goes into it. It's aggressive dialing practices, which is, how often are you calling the same numbers? How often are you calling the same number within a certain window, or whether that be several hours or several hours within a day, whether the time zone's closing. There's a whole bunch of things that go into how they look at scoring, the types of traffic. And ultimately, if your number gets flagged with one of the big three analytics companies, you've got to initiate. You got a couple choices. Either A, which is I think what most people do, they just burn the number and go buy more numbers, or if it's a number that's critical to your business that's been flagged for either the aggressive dialing practices, or in the first scenario where just enough people hit the report button, you've got to go through a mediation process with those companies, and they all have them. Some of them are click here and open a Zendesk ticket and we'll get to you when we get to you. That's a lot of it, especially on the free side. I think it's interesting that all three of these have commercial products for scrubbing numbers off of bad reputation lists, right? That's where I think the whole mafia thing comes in. It's like, okay, you're going to flag all my stuff and say it's bad, and then you're going to turn around, but hey, for $10 a number, I'll clean it all up for you. I think that's problematic. Um, so we'll see, what kind of antitrust stuff happens there, but I have to imagine it will happen.
Right. Hmm. Hey, Mike, it would be okay if I start shooting you some questions that have come in?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think appreciate the update on StirShaken. I think we did clear up some of the common misconceptions, which I think we'll reiterate in some of these questions I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important. I'm glad you talked about, we really do need to separate, what StirShaken is doing, which is allowing us to find the source of the call and call reputation, two totally separate things. And I think, and again, I think some of these
Yeah.
questions will
And
shed a light.
one of the
Yeah.
things nobody talks about is certificate reputation, because I
Mm.
don't think it's become an issue yet.
Mm.
But certificate
Oh,
reputation is
yeah.
gonna, I think, be a thing. Um,
And by the
just
way,
as a trusted source of an ingress point into I don't want to use the word PSTN, but I'm going to use PSTN because everybody knows what it means. The phone network, which is a combination of IP and PSTN. But I think ultimately certificate reputation is going to matter. And then the other thing that nobody's talking about outside of the maybe 4 people that I've spoken to, and I've got one buddy over at Numerical who's maniacal about this, and he's right, is that phone numbers being considered a source of identity is almost an absurd um, notion.
mm,
You think about how ephemeral they are. If I want new numbers, I just go get new numbers. Why does that make me? How does that tell you who I am at all? Right. So I think that once they figure out that this doesn't work all the way,
mm,
there's going to have to be a discussion around identity and
yeah,
how do you identify the calling source party on regardless of network, and how do you create mobility with that identity? How do you take it with you from
right.
provider to provider?
Well, Mike, I'm glad you brought up the certificate reputation. That was the first question came in from Richard, was kind of gave a story about how he is using his technology. We call a consumer to a buyer, a call that would be B level attestation, but when we do that, carriers in the middle will answer with voicemail messages. So his question really is, what would they be using somehow in these stats per certificate? I think that's still an open question, right? We don't know the answer to that yet.
Yeah, and this is a legitimate use case. I mean, you
Mhm.
think about it. Let's say I'm Terminix. I don't know, bad example. Just whatever. I'm a company and my job is to go spray bugs. I don't want to have a call center. So I'm going to hire a company to go out and do marketing for me. And I want them to use my number so that customers know it's me. Right. That's a legitimate use case. But he's right. That will most likely get flagged as a B. I don't know how, unless you're using the provider they bought it from, that would be flagged in any other way. And I think that's where we're starting to hear some discussions, at least around uh, intermediate certificates, right? How can I sign something on someone's behalf and with some sort of an LOA that proves that I'm allowed to use this on their behalf, um, to solve that, right? That's a big open hole.
Mhm. Um, Mike, let me just go ahead and start peppering them your way. Giovanni was asking, is it mandatory that small resellers have full stir shaken completed and implemented by June 30th? That June 30th was 2 years ago, right? That
Yeah,
initial deadline.
that's
Yeah,
been gone. What I think he's talking
yeah,
about is the leftovers, everybody
yeah,
else that are
right.
come in at the end of this month. And the answer is yeah. Like
Yeah,
everybody
right.
who's sending calls or processing traffic at all is grouped into this last requirement.
That's right.
And Tim, we should definitely like gather up all these FCC things because
Yeah,
I'm not a legal person, but I've read these things. But we should put them out as reference so they can take
yep.
them to their legal crews and stuff like that. But yeah, it does include everyone.
No, it's a good point. We'll add that to the webinar recording email when we send it out tomorrow. Great idea.
Yeah, and the
Yeah,
7 updates.
right, right. Yeah, we'll make sure we cover up on those. Trevor was asking, so what would happen in the event that you release a number from your inventory and then someone else claims that number and it has a bad reputation? Is it permanently stuck in TN hell?
and that and that's the problem with these reputation engines from the big three analytics companies. There is no yet, you know, sort of release process like there is with like texting, where it's like, okay, I've released it, unprovision it, and you can sell it and set up a new texting provider, right? There's like a cascading foreign key sort of relationship. That needs to happen, right? There needs to be uh, an automated mechanism for disconnecting numbers that gets proliferated to all the relevant places, not just providers, but analytics companies as well. Um, that's the problem. I mean, I was having a sort of a side conversation Tuesday, I want to say, and we spot checked like 5,000 new numbers we purchased. I think like north of 70% came back as some sort of flag we had to go remediate. I've talked to you know, some folks at Numerical. Their numbers were a little different, but I would say north of 60%. But I mean, this is not a one company's problem. This is a problem for everybody that I think is going to it has to get addressed, right? You can't have 60+% of your brand new numbers, so-called new numbers. They're probably all, they probably have been recycled, but
Yeah.
can't have them all come back out as, with bad reputations once they've been disconnected and cooled down for the
Right.
appropriate amount of time
Yeah.
with no data, no traffic on them.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Um, Gene is asking, how can I see whether my calls are being properly attested? I don't know why I have a hard time pronouncing that. I have two carriers. How can I be sure that they're being properly attested? And how can I see whether I'm coming up as spam likely on people's phones? How can I do that?
Yeah, there are reputation tools for that. Um, my grandfather was a businessman in the 60s and 70s, and he always told me, you never mention another company's product. But there are reputation. All I'll say is you can Google caller ID reputation companies. They'll have tools that you can subscribe to that have basically SIM banks sitting out on the internet. You can call and it'll present you an image from an iPhone, an Android phone on each of the networks, so you can visibly see it and also get the data back. There are other companies that have free tools that they'll give you a phone number on, or like 10 phone numbers on different networks, and you can call it and it'll read to you in your ear like a 6-digit pin. Then you put the pin in and it'll give you the data. It'll show you
Hmm.
this is the certificate broken down. It's decoded. We've broken out all the components. You can see the level of attestation. You can see. Now, I'll tell you, I've used these tools myself, and the answer to your question is it depends on who you ask. Because we sign all of our calls ourselves. I used a similar tool where I called, let's say, an AT&T number, another VoIP company number, Big CLEC in Raleigh, and I'm telling you, when it came in on the Big CLEC in Raleigh, they did not respect my attestation. It came in with a different attestation than what AT&T showed. So
Wow.
there are companies out there, I think, that strip and replace, because it was not my certificate that was on that call. It was the Big CLEC certificate that was on that call.
Wow, that's certainly problematic.
Right.
Richard was chiming back in here with there is a national database that we're supposed to be checking when a number is returned to ensure the lead we have isn't before the number was returned. Why don't the reputation companies not have to ping that database to ensure the reputation they have is not from a previous owner?
Yeah, you're right. That did come up in a topic this week.
Hmm.
I'm gonna have to research that one. I was kind of sitting on the sideline in that discussion, but I do recall that database, and I know we do report to it when we disconnect numbers. It's required. I think we have to do it like once a month or twice a month. I think it's once a month, but there's like a batch that's submitted on or before the 10th of the month that goes into this. It is supposed to be, I would think, used for a purpose like that.
Hmm.
I'm not sure why it's not.
Yeah, great question, Richard. Appreciate that one. Let's see. Uh, are there any tracker softwares that you can tell when a DID's gone spam? Something like DNC.com does, but it's way too expensive. I'm not sure I've heard of DNC.com.
Like
DN,
Democratic National
do
Committee.
or do not call.com. I'd have
Do not. Yeah. Okay. That makes more sense.
probably yeah.
Read the
Anyway,
question again.
is there any sort of tracker software that we can use to tell you when a DID is gone to spam, has basically turned into a spam likely call?
I mean, I think the only way I
Oh,
would do that would be to subscribe to one of these caller ID reputation applications and periodically run your numbers through it in batches or something, like check them whatever
right.
interval you want to.
Richard was chiming in to help. He said DNC.com is also contact center compliance. Interesting. Okay. Another one for you, Mike, is I've been told by my provider that anything other than an A attestation on my calls will lead to spam likely messages on caller ID. Is this not true?
I think we've proven that's not
Yeah,
true.
it's not true. That's right.
I think that consumed so much of the discussion in mid-May
Hmm.
at the conference, and I feel confident with the group of folks that we had that were having this discussion that that's not true. It shouldn't be true to
Yeah.
say that.
Well, and on top of it, just to hear that there are other companies that are stripping off attestation and or that's I don't even know what
But
leaves me speechless. Like, what's the
but I
point?
mean, I'm not saying there's not a correlation between the attestation level and your likelihood to get reported. I think it comes down to your dialing practices. So, like, let me just say, be very clear about this. If your business model is based around the type of traffic that is no longer desirable, like, you should just punch out of this right now, because there is nothing that is going to save you. Right. The goal is to get rid of this stuff, or to, mitigate it to a point where it's no longer a consumer problem. Right now, the consumers are driving this narrative. So unless and until the pressure is released, they're coming. I mean, I saw, I was reading through some FCC articles before this webinar, and there was a direct quote from, I can't remember the lady's name, but she was one of the top folks there, that said, "We will absolutely will not stop until we eradicate this. Like, this is like priority one." So I think for those that have accidentally tripped into something and gotten flagged at spam likely, I think there's a path forward for you that doesn't mean you have to have an A all the time, but it means that if you go back, and when we share this, go back to the aggressive dialing practices. If any of your business practices look like that, it might be a good idea to look at those and refine those to fall within that, and get you off those sort of trends. But I think there is definitely a correlation between behavior and reputation.
Yeah. By the way, Richard chiming back in here saying that he did test one of our DIDs to test the attestation level. It said B, and then he looked up the ID on calleridreputation.com and they showed an A. So there's definitely some swap outs happening.
Mm-hmm.
You saw it
Oh,
real time.
I've proven it too. It gets swapped out, and like, we're still, like I said, we're still at the beginning of the webinar. We're still like, the dust is settling, the people are coming to the surface. We're having discussions,
Yep.
and things are starting to normalize. Like, I don't know if you remember in the early day. I'm sad to say, old enough to remember, when SIP first became mainstream, and at the time I was just a network guy. So I'm sitting in a conference room with, the CTO of a very large CLEC in Raleigh at the time, in the early 2000s, in a literal screaming match with the folks over at level 3 about SIP RFC compliance standards, because nobody could agree on what a SIP header should look like.
Mm.
Right. But that's gone. Like, we all agree on what that should look like now. I think it's very analogous to that. Like, we're just sort of in this zone where there's some folks doing it one way, some folks doing it another way, some folks doing it in a slightly modified version of one or two, and that we're just sort of point code revisions off from one another. And I think eventually it'll come together.
Yeah. It'll have to.
That's my opinion.
Well, Ronald said something interesting, Mike. He said, hey, if your signed call is going to travel across a non-IP network segment, your out of station is absolutely going to be stripped, right?
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Right.
PSTN, is absolved, right? It's too costly. Their arguments too costly. Our equipment's too old. We can't support it. We're not going to do the investment. I'm not saying those are bad reasons, but that's why they're not included. So, I mean, when you call, grandma, I don't know, my grandma has an iPhone, but okay, great grandma, you know, you know,
Right. Right.
you can still call them, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Two
And
other
maybe that's why they're the target. They still have
could
the
be.
wall phones.
They're the ones giving out their personal information just because they're happy
Right.
to have somebody to talk to, but that's for another topic.
Hmm.
Um, like my mother-in-law. Two
Hmm.
things actually. Giovanni came back and said he was that small provider that was asking about the June 30th deadline. He goes, hey, are we able to get an extension to that because we're going to need some extra time? I think the answer is probably, unfortunately, no at this point, right? I mean, it's
I
been
would say
2 years.
call the FCC and ask them.
Yeah,
I mean, I
good,
say that
good luck. It's
in jest, but
facetiously.
like,
Yeah, yeah,
I can't answer that question, and I'm gonna
right.
bet you the answer is no.
Yeah,
If you can even get anybody to respond.
right, right. JR was asking, where does Commio stand with signing calls with Orig DIDs from another service provider? As in, can we send you a list of certified DIDs that we have and that we're authorized to send them from, so we can attest higher?
Yeah, you're
Interesting.
talking about like an LOA off net number sort of thing. We've talked about this.
Mm-hmm.
There we don't do that right now. I mean, you can bring off net numbers for text enablement. We can do that for you.
Yeah.
But I can't attest and off. We don't have an LOA process for that yet. We talked about, when we do things like that, if it's even allowed, we got to run it through legal to make sure it's compliant and everything else. But it is an idea that has been discussed. And then it comes down to, okay, well, what are the legal, implications? We want to make sure we're not doing anything to break the rules, that kind of thing. So there's that whole discussion, which usually ends up being the major blocker in advancing those kinds of ideas. And then beyond that, it's like, okay, how do you do it in such a way where it's as self-service as possible without having a bunch of extra headcount on a desk that responds to authorize my numbers on your network kind of LOA request, kind of like porting. Um, so I would say the best thing to do is just port us the number and then no
Right.
problem.
That's true. Goes away. All right, Mike, I got 4 quick questions for you. Let's keep them tight, and we'll see if we can get done before the top of the hour. What do you say?
Yeah.
Um, this is from a call center that's based in Canada. Most of my volume is going to the US. Our legal team is telling me that we should sign our own calls. We've registered with the mitigation database, but our current provider is giving us a B attestation. If we invested in signing our own calls, what would it take? And would we then get an A? And would this eliminate spam likely false messages with customers?
Yeah. I mean, you'd have to go get an OCN and then register with certificate authority, CTA, and get a certificate and be registered there. There's a whole process outlined.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know that there are a number of resources out there that can walk you through exactly how to do that.
But Mike, does it sound like they even need to go through all those steps? Isn't a B attestation, again, it's not a signifier of quality or spam or anything, right? So
It's
B
not
would make sense.
it's
Yeah.
not yeah. I mean, there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with B. A lot of times
Right.
B is more believable than A. I mean,
Yeah.
to use sort of street language, I mean, does it make sense that everyone would have a certificate and the authority to sign everything? No, right? So I would expect a lot of legitimate calls to have a B.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways of things that people thought they knew about Stir Shaken that wasn't necessarily true. Because you've already gone through it, what a B means versus an A. So a B
Mm-hmm.
makes perfect sense and is not bad.
Mm-hmm.
What do you
I
think,
think
Mike?
I think that was the
Yeah,
biggest mistake they made when they created the structure for this was they
right.
created a letter grading system that,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
growing up in the United States and when I went to school, A, B, and C meant something, and it still means something in my head. Now
Yeah,
I get my kid's report card; it's got like a 1, 2, 3, and all kinds of other stuff on there. But I
yeah.
mean, they probably should have used something other than a letter grading system, because I think it just creates a psychological assumption, right? Oh my God,
Right.
it's a C, it's average, or
Yep. Right.
uh,
Yeah. Yep. Makes sense. Yeah. A, B, and C, not a great idea. Mike, what do you think calling will look like in a couple of years? What will we need to be doing, and will we ever get rid of spam calls anyway? It's a pretty open
well,
question.
I think that if the idea of assigning and tracking identity to entities that play on the phone networks happens, I think it'll go. We've solved this problem, right? We solved it for email. This problem got solved a while ago. It just hasn't been applied to telephony.
Mhm.
Um, that's a really, really broad question. Where do I think calling is going to go in the future? I mean, I think there will absolutely be some method of either identity, or they will drastically reduce the number of people that could participate and have a business in the market, right? That
Yep.
they could funnel it through those that are complying with and implementing these rules.
Yep.
And then at
Uh,
that point, it's really it creates a very few choke points to get
right.
shut off.
Right. I have a feeling I know what you're going to say with this one, but I'm going to ask anyway direct. Our company is not based in North America, but our calls are legitimate. Will we always have a C attestation, or what can we do to make sure our calls go through, are labeled correctly or at a higher level? I'm looking at several countries, not in the US, and wondering if that's where the question is coming from.
Uh, yeah, I mean, the only way that you're going to get anything above a C is by having a commercially verified and viable relationship with an entity that has the authorization to sign the call with that level. Um, International DIDs are off the table. You can't use them. You're
Mm,
buying USD IDs, better have a very strong, valid, know your customer kind of relationship with whomever you're buying the numbers from, or they're not going to give it to you either.
makes sense. Last but not least, we're a small call center with a small budget. What do you think is our best approach to ensure that we're not being labeled as spam? Is there a way to guarantee that we're not marked that way?
There are no guarantees in life.
Right.
That's all I'll say.
Well, as per that
You're,
email I sent you
you're
yesterday, by the way, that email that
well,
promised from another provider said we promise you're going to be fine, and you can't
well,
do that.
that's a lie.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Right.
there are no guarantees. I can't even guarantee that with the cleanest possible scenario, one of your numbers doesn't get flagged because of an end user, consumer thing, or one of the big three analytics decides to change their algorithm and you get flagged.
Right.
The best way to stay off the radar is by not fitting into the profile of sort of aggressive or predatory dialing practices. Make sure that you've got a plan filed with the robocall mitigation database to make sure that um, you're calling folks who've either opted in or aren't going to report you. Um, there's no guarantee. There,
Yep.
there, there are. It's mostly behavior and business case use application sort of driven. So I get this question a lot.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thanks for coming right up against the hour. Just it's a great set of information to pass along. I think we updated a lot of people's information about Shaken. Let's see, Giovanni. Giovanni, I think we should set up some time to talk separately. I know you've got some pretty direct questions here, and I know you feel like you're up against a gun, but based on some of the chats you're putting in here, it looks like you might actually be in a good position. So somebody we could definitely take offline, and we could talk one-on-one with any questions you might have. But Mike, want to thank you. I know, again, super busy guy, and appreciate your time, and everybody on the call and your questions. And like I said, we will be sending out a recording of this, and you're going to have questions. And I always send those messages with my email as the reply. So please, if you have questions, hit reply. Thoughts, ideas, comments, whatever you need, I'll funnel those to Mike. We'll get back to you, and we will work hard on including some additional information in the email to help you get to the bottom of some of these questions. Like Giovanni, I think you have questions as a as your business and you feel like you're up against this deadline in a couple days, and do you feel like you might already have a solution or need to do something different? Hopefully that'll give you the link to the places you need to go to find the right answer, or we can work on you one-on-one. And I think, Mike, I want to leave everybody on the call with this thought is one of the things hopefully you're taking away from this is, folks like Commio and, Mike, we've got a great customer success team. We've got a great knock team. We've got some great people here who the real reason that sort of we operate the way that we do and we have the relationships we have with our customers is because we stay open to these industry trends, and then we translate that down to your level to make sure that you're properly, either being attested or that you're following the compliance rules. And we're here to help make sure that your use case that's unique to those compliance rules are properly addressed, and that not that we're keeping you out of trouble, we're helping you be compliant, because we all, including Commio, want to be good stewards of this network that we've created and that we are all a part of, because we want to see robocalls go away. We want to see bad texts go away. And we all just want to be able to have access to this great network, that we're all a part of. If that sounds Pollyanna, I don't think it is. That's just the way it is in 2023, and that's how we want to operate. So, again, please reply to that email. We'll get you what you need, and we'll work on a good email to help you get what you need to self-feed going forward. But Mike, again, thank you for your time, and everybody watch for another invitation to our upcoming briefings, and we'll try to keep you guys as up to date as we get the information that we get on all these matters. So appreciate all your time today. Thank you, Mike.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. All right. Bye.